I hadn't seen my family in 3 years. Then Mom's birthday came, and something in me softened. I drove 12 hours through pouring rain with a homemade cake. I walked into the party smiling, cake box shaking in my hands. My father stood up before I even said hello. He pointed at me and said one word, sinner. 6 months later, a letter arrived that changed everything. What it revealed made my father drop to his knees. My name is Daniel Whitfield, 29 years old, raised in Millhaven, Texas, a town where everyone attended First Baptist and gossip traveled faster than the mail. My father, Robert, was a deacon. My mother, Carol, ran the church bake sale every spring. My younger brother Caleb still lived 2 streets from our childhood home. I came out to my parents when I was 19, home from college for winter break, naive enough to believe love could survive the truth. My father didn't yell that night. He simply left the kitchen and didn't speak to me again for 11 days. My mother cried quietly at the stove, more afraid of what the church would say than of losing her son. Caleb, only 16 then, didn't understand any of it. Just watched our family crack down the middle. I moved to Chicago for college and never really came back, building a life 3 states away from Millhaven's whispers. Every Christmas I sent cards. Every Christmas I got polite, careful replies that never once mentioned us or who I loved. My mother called on birthdays, always in a hushed voice, always glancing over her shoulder like the walls might report her. My father never called at all, not once in 10 years, as if silence could erase the son he didn't want. The town still remembered me as the Whitfield boy who left in shame, a story retold every Sunday over coffee and casseroles. Pastor Nolan had preached a sermon the year I left, never naming me, but everyone in the pews knew exactly who he meant. I built a good life in Chicago, a design job, a small apartment, a boyfriend named Marcus who made me laugh again. Then, 3 weeks ago, my mother sent a text I read 4 times. Please come home for my birthday. I miss you. Marcus watched me pack the car, worry creasing his forehead. Are you sure they're ready for this? He asked. And I wasn't sure at all. I told him I just wanted to see my mother turn 60. Nothing more. No big declarations. No confrontations. Just a cake and a hug. I baked her favorite lemon cake myself. The same recipe she'd taught me at 8 years old, standing on a kitchen stool. The drive from Chicago to Millhaven was 12 hours, and I spent every one of them rehearsing what I might say. Rain started somewhere in Missouri and never let up, drumming against the windshield like a warning I chose to ignore. I passed the Millhaven town sign at dusk, faded and rust-spotted, exactly as I remembered it from a decade ago. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I turned onto Maple Street, the porch lights of my childhood home glowing ahead. Cars lined the driveway. Aunts, uncles, cousins. Pastor Nolan's sedan, the whole extended Whitfield family gathered under one roof. I sat in the car for 10 minutes, cake balanced on my lap, gathering courage I wasn't sure I actually had. Finally, I walked up the porch steps, rain soaking my jacket, and knocked on a door I used to have a key to. My mother opened it, gasped, and pulled me into a hug so tight I nearly dropped the cake box. Over her shoulder, I saw my father's face change from confusion to something colder, harder, the second he recognized me. The living room went silent as I stepped inside, 30 pairs of eyes turning toward the doorway all at once. My father rose slowly from his armchair, jaw tight, the Bible he'd been reading still open on his knee. "What is he doing here?" he said. Not to me, but to my mother, as if I were a stranger who'd wandered in. I invited him. "Robert," my mother whispered, gripping my arm like she already knew what was coming next. My father crossed the room in 4 heavy steps, stopping close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. "This is my wife's birthday," he said, voice low and shaking. "Not a stage for you to parade your sin." A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. Others, I noticed, simply looked away, unwilling to meet my eyes at all. "I just came to celebrate, Mom," I said, holding up the cake box like some fragile peace offering. My father knocked it from my hands before I finished the sentence, lemon cake shattering across the hardwood floor. Someone gasped, and by the fireplace, took a step forward, then froze, unsure whose side to choose. "Robert, please," my mother begged, tears already spilling. "It's my birthday. Can't we just have one normal night?" "Normal," my father repeated bitterly, "is not what walked through that door tonight. Carol, and you know it." Pastor Nolan cleared his throat from the corner, and for a horrible second I braced myself for another sermon. Instead he said nothing, just studied his shoes, and something about his silence felt heavier than any words. My father turned back to me, finger raised, and said the words that would follow me for months. "You are the gay sin of this family." The room seemed to hold its breath, and I felt every childhood memory in that house curdle at once. My Aunt Ruthie, usually the loudest voice at any gathering, pressed a hand over her mouth and said nothing. I looked at Caleb, silently pleading for something, anything, but he only stared at the broken cake on the floor. "I drove 12 hours, I said quietly, my voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady. "For her birthday." "Then you can drive 12 hours back," my father snapped. "Because there's no place for that lifestyle in this house." My mother sobbed openly now, caught between the husband she'd married and the son she'd carried for 9 months. I remembered, absurdly, baking that same lemon cake with her when I was 8, flour dusting both our faces. Now the cake lay ruined on the floor, yellow crumbs scattered like everything else that used to feel whole. "Robert, that's enough," came a voice from the hallway, my grandmother, Eleanor, leaning on her cane, eyes blazing. My father's jaw tightened, but even he seemed to hesitate before his own mother, 91 years old and unafraid. "This is still my family too," Grandma Eleanor said, "and I will not watch you throw my grandson into the rain." For one flickering moment, I thought the night might turn, until my father simply walked past her toward the door. He opened it himself, rain gusting in, and said, "You have 5 minutes to get off my property." "Daniel." "It's my property too," my mother said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself, from the sound of her own voice. My father turned, stunned, as if the wife who never argued had just spoken a foreign language in her own home. "The house is in both our names. Robert," she continued, shaking but steady, "you don't get to decide this alone." Caleb finally moved, stepping between our father and me, though I still couldn't tell whose side he was standing on. "Dad, maybe we should all just breathe," Caleb said carefully, and our father's glare swung toward him instead of me. I stood frozen in the doorway, rain at my back, uncertain whether to stay and fight or simply disappear. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the rain hide whatever was left of my composure, breathing hard against the cold. My mother followed a moment later, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, refusing to meet my father's demand that I leave. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought if I just brought you both into one room, maybe things would be different. It's not your fault." "Mom," I said, though some small part of me had hoped for the same impossible thing. She squeezed my hand and told me not to drive back tonight. Not in this storm. Not with my heart this heavy. I found a motel on the edge of town. The same one where cousins used to sneak beer as teenagers. Lying on the stiff bed, I texted Marcus one line. It was worse than I imagined, and turned off my phone. Around midnight, a text came through from an unknown number. It's Caleb. Can we talk tomorrow? Please. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure whether it was an olive branch or another trap. Finally, I wrote back one word. Okay, and set the phone down. Exhausted, uncertain what tomorrow would bring. Caleb met me the next morning at a diner outside of town. Sunglasses on despite the gray Texas sky. I need to tell you something I've never told anyone, he said. Hands wrapped tight around his coffee cup. My stomach dropped, half expecting more cruelty. But instead, Caleb's voice cracked with something closer to fear. I'm gay too. Daniel, he said finally, staring at the table. I have been since I was 14. He said stunt. The diner noise fading, as 10 years of assumptions about my little brother rearranged themselves instantly. I watched what happened to you, Caleb said, and I promised myself I'd never let that happen to me. He'd married his college girlfriend, Rachel, 2 years ago, built a careful life designed entirely around never being found out. Does Rachel know? I asked gently, and Caleb shook his head, guilt written across every line of his face. I love her, he said, just not the way a husband is supposed to, and it's eating me alive. I reached across the table and gripped his hand. The first real connection we'd had in over a decade. You didn't have to carry that alone, I told him. Though I understood exactly why he had. Caleb wiped his eyes and said there was something else. Something about Grandma Eleanor and her will. She changed it last spring, he said. Left the old farmhouse and half her savings directly to you. I blinked, certain I'd misheard him. I hadn't spoken to my grandmother in years except for holiday cards. She's been writing to you, Caleb said, sending letters to your old Chicago address, hoping you'd write back. I realized then that half my unopened mail over the years might have carried more than junk and bills. Dad doesn't know about the will yet, Caleb warned. But when he finds out, it's going to get ugly. I asked why Grandma Eleanor would leave me so much when we'd barely spoken in a decade. Caleb hesitated, then said, she told me once that history was repeating itself, and she wouldn't let it happen twice. I didn't understand what he meant, and Caleb admitted he didn't either, only that it mattered deeply to her. That afternoon, Grandma Eleanor called and asked me to come by the farmhouse alone, away from the rest of the family. Her hands trembled as she poured 2 cups of tea, the same chipped china set from my childhood memories. You have your great-uncle Walter's eyes, she said suddenly. A name I had never once heard spoken in our house. I asked who Walter was, and her expression folded into something old and sorrowful. Decades deep. He was your father's older brother, she said quietly. And he was gay. Just like you. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through everything I thought I knew about my family. In 1974, this family did to him exactly what your father did to you last night, she said. Voice breaking. Walter left Millhaven at 22 and was never spoken of again. Erased from photo albums and Sunday dinner conversations alike. He died alone in Houston 12 years later, Grandma Eleanor said. And your father has never forgiven himself for staying silent. He said Folsen, finally understanding the rigid fury in my father's eyes. Not simple hatred, but buried, unbearable guilt. Your father loved his brother, she said, and he has spent 50 years punishing the wrong person for that loss. I asked why no one had ever told me any of this before. And she said, shame like that buries itself deep. I'm not leaving you that farmhouse for money, she said. I'm leaving it so this family remembers what it almost erased. That night, back at the motel, I couldn't stop thinking about a man named Walter I'd never known existed. I searched an old genealogy website and found a single photograph, a young man with my exact same smile. Underneath it, a caption read only, Walter Whitfield, beloved son, with no date of death. No further explanation offered. I texted Caleb the photo, and he replied instantly, I found that same picture in Dad's desk drawer once. He cried. Something in me softened toward my father for the first time in years, even as the anger stayed sharp underneath. The next morning, Pastor Nolan called and asked to meet me privately at the church, away from prying eyes. I almost said no, bracing for another lecture, but something in his tone made me agree instead. Pastor Nolan led me into his office, closed the door, and said words I never expected from him. I owe you an apology. He explained that the sermon years ago hadn't been his choice. That deacon pressure, my father's pressure, had shaped every word. I've counseled 3 gay members of this congregation privately, he admitted. Always in secret. Always afraid of losing my pulpit. I asked why he'd stayed silent at the party then, and he admitted plainly that fear had won over conviction that night. I'm trying to change that, he said, starting with telling you the truth, even if it costs me everything. He told me the church board was quietly debating an inclusion policy, and my story, whether I wanted it or not, was part of that fight. I left the church unsure whether to feel hopeful or exhausted, carrying one more secret weight on an already heavy week. That evening, my father showed up at my motel room, rain-soaked, standing awkwardly in the doorway like a stranger. Your grandmother told you about Walter, he said. Not a question, just a statement heavy with resignation. I nodded, and for the first time in my life, I watched my father's shoulders actually fold under grief. I was 17 when they sent him away, he said, and I never said a word to stop it. He described a summer night decades ago. A suitcase packed in silence. A father, my great-grandfather, who never spoke Walter's name again. I told myself I was protecting this family from the same shame, he said, when really I was just repeating it. You could have chosen differently with me, I said quietly. And he had no answer. Only a long, broken silence. I know, he finally said. And I don't know how to fix 50 years of being wrong in one conversation. I told him fixing it didn't require perfect words. Just a willingness to actually try. Starting tonight if he wanted. He didn't hug me. Didn't apologize outright. But he sat down on the edge of the motel bed and stayed. We talked until nearly 2 in the morning. About Walter. About Chicago. About Marcus. About years neither of us understood the other. It wasn't forgiveness yet. Not fully. But it was the longest honest conversation we'd shared in over a decade. The next morning, word had already spread through Millhaven that the Whitfields' oldest son had come back different, causing a stir. At the grocery store, my mother told me later, a woman she'd known 30 years pointedly looked away from her. Caleb, meanwhile, had finally decided he couldn't keep living a lie inside his own marriage any longer. He sat Rachel down that same week and told her everything, terrified of losing the life they'd built together. To his shock, Rachel cried not from betrayal, but from relief, admitting she'd sensed something unspoken between them for years. I'd rather have the truth and figure out what's next, she told him, than keep living half a marriage. Meanwhile, my father's business partner at the hardware store heard rumors and threatened to pull out over family scandal. My father, to my surprise, told the man plainly that if loyalty depended on hating his own son, the partnership was over. Word of that conversation spread through town almost as fast as the original gossip had, shifting something subtle in the air. Aunt Ruthie called my mother, furious that the family's dirty laundry was becoming Sunday dinner conversation across Millhaven. My mother, gentler than I'd ever heard her, told Ruthie that loving her son wasn't laundry, it was simply love. Grandma Eleanor, hearing all of this unfold, decided it was time to finally read Walter's story publicly, once and for all. She asked the whole family to gather again at the farmhouse, this time to hear the truth instead of hide it. I drove out with Caleb, Marcus flying in unexpectedly to stand beside me, uncertain what kind of reception awaited either of us. The farmhouse driveway filled with cars again, but this time the air felt different, heavier with truth and shame. Marcus squeezed my hand as we walked up the same porch steps where my father had thrown me out days earlier. My mother greeted him warmly, pulling him into a hug before he could even introduce himself properly. My father stood by the window, visibly uncomfortable, but he didn't leave the room, and that alone felt like progress. Grandma Eleanor sat at the head of the dining table, a worn wooden box in front of her, hands folded carefully. These are Walter's letters, she said. The ones he sent me in secret. The ones I hid for 50 years. The room fell quiet. Even Aunt Ruthie, who had come determined to argue, suddenly had nothing left to say. Outside, a car pulled into the driveway unannounced. Pastor Nolan, uninvited but sent by conscience, standing awkwardly at the door. My mother let him in without hesitation, and he took a seat quietly near the back, saying nothing at first. Grandma Eleanor opened the first letter, her voice shaking as she began reading Walter's own words aloud for the family. He'd written about Houston, about finding work, about missing Sunday dinners more than he ever admitted to anyone back home. He'd also written, in his final letter, that he forgave his family before he ever expected forgiveness in return. My father's hands were shaking now, gripping the back of a chair like it was the only thing holding him upright. He never stopped loving us, Grandma Eleanor said, even after we stopped choosing to love him back. Caleb stood beside Rachel, who had come despite everything, quietly reaching for his hand under the table. I looked around the room. Marcus, Caleb, my mother, even Pastor Nolan, and felt something shift. Finally, toward the light, my father stood abruptly, and for one terrible second, I thought he was about to walk out entirely. Instead, he walked to where I stood beside Marcus, stopping just a few feet away, breathing hard. I don't want to bury another son the way my father buried his, he said, voice raw and unsteady. The room held its breath completely, waiting to see what 50 years of silence would finally choose to become. Grandma Eleanor closed the wooden box gently and said, "Then don't, Robert. It's not too late for this one." My father reached out, hand trembling, and for the first time in 10 years, he pulled me into an embrace. I stood stiff for a moment and used to the weight of his arms before finally letting myself hold on back. "I'm sorry," he whispered against my shoulder, words I had waited a decade to hear and almost stopped expecting. Behind us, my mother began crying openly, relief flooding a face that had carried tension for years without rest. Aunt Ruthie, however, stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the wood floor, refusing to accept what she was witnessing. "This family is falling apart," she snapped, chasing some modern nonsense instead of the values we were raised on. Grandma Eleanor turned to her sharply, voice steady despite her age. "The values we were raised on buried a good man alone. Ruthie's face reddened, and she grabbed her purse, announcing she wouldn't stay to watch this circus continue any longer. Then go, my father said quietly, surprising everyone. But don't come back expecting me to choose you over my son again. Ruthie stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. My mother started toward the door, torn between her sister and her son, before Grandma Eleanor gently stopped her. Let her go. Carol, she said, some people need time, and some never come around. Both are her choice, not yours. Pastor Nolan finally spoke up, voice steady now that the hardest words had already been said by others. I came here to tell you something, he said. The church board voted last night, unanimously, for full inclusion. The room turned toward him, stunned, as he explained 3 other families had quietly reached out after hearing whispers about my story. Turns out, he said, more of this town was hiding the same fear than any of us realized. Caleb squeezed Rachel's hand and stood a little straighter, as if some invisible weight had finally eased off his shoulders. I want to tell people, Caleb said suddenly, looking at me. Not hide it anymore. Not even from Millhaven. Rachel nodded beside him. And for the first time all week, Caleb actually smiled. Small but real. My father looked at Caleb, understanding dawning slowly across his face, as pieces he'd never questioned finally clicked together. Both my sons, he said quietly, almost to himself, testing the words like a language he was only just learning. He turned to Marcus, who had stood quietly through all of it, and extended a hand, still stiff but sincere. I don't know you yet, my father said, but you drove here for my son, and that means something to me. Marcus shook his hand firmly, and something like relief passed visibly across his face for the first time all day. Grandma Eleanor stood, leaning on her cane, and raised her teacup like it was the finest champagne in the room. To Walter, she said, voice thick, who should have been standing in this room 50 years ago and wasn't. Everyone raised their cups, even Pastor Nolan, even my mother through her tears, even my father, hands still shaking. Outside, the rain that had followed me the entire drive from Chicago finally broke into thin, clean sunlight. I stepped onto the porch again, this time with Marcus beside me instead of alone in the storm. My father joined us a moment later, standing quietly, watching the light spread slowly across the wet farmland. Your grandmother's farmhouse, he said. She wants you to have it. I think you should take it. I asked if that would be strange. Him watching me inherit the very thing tied to his brother's exile. It'll be a relief, he said. Watching this house finally hold the son it should have held all along. For the first time since I arrived in Millhaven, I let myself believe things might actually stay this way. Word spread through town over the following days, faster than any gossip had ever traveled through Millhaven before. Some neighbors avoided our family at church the next Sunday, whispering behind hymnals, unwilling to let old habits die. Others, surprisingly, approached my mother after the service, quietly admitting they had gay children or siblings of their own. Pastor Nolan stood at the pulpit that morning and, for the first time, spoke Walter Whitfield's name aloud. He announced the church's new inclusion policy plainly, without apology, while my father sat beside me in the pew. A few families walked out mid-sermon, but far more stayed, some crying quietly, some simply nodding along. After the service, an elderly man I didn't recognize approached me, eyes wet, hand outstretched and trembling. I knew your uncle, he said. Back when we were young. I always wondered what happened to him. He told me Walter had once been the best baseball pitcher Millhaven had ever seen, before he vanished from town records. Hearing a stranger speak Walter's name with warmth undid something in me that even my family's apology hadn't reached yet. Caleb came out publicly the following week. A short, honest post that spread through the small town within hours. Rachel stood beside him in every photo, and together they began the slow, complicated process of redefining their marriage honestly. My father, to everyone's shock, shared Caleb's post himself, writing simply, "Proud of my son." Both of them. Aunt Ruthie eventually softened, showing up quietly at Thanksgiving months later, saying little but staying the whole afternoon. Grandma Eleanor framed Walter's photograph and hung it in the farmhouse hallway, finally restoring him to the family wall. I signed the farmhouse papers that November, Marcus beside me, promising to fill the old rooms with new memories. We repainted Walter's old bedroom first, leaving one small shelf for the letters Grandma Eleanor had kept for 50 years. My father visited every few weeks, slowly learning how to simply exist beside his son without flinching or apologizing. One afternoon he found me repairing the porch steps and, without a word, picked up a hammer and joined me. We didn't talk much that day, but the silence between us finally felt peaceful instead of painful for the first time. Millhaven didn't change overnight, but it changed slowly. One Sunday sermon and one honest conversation at a time. The town that once called me ashamed started, quietly and imperfectly, learning how to call me simply family again. A year later, we hosted Mom's 61st birthday at the farmhouse. Cake baked together this time, no one throwing it. Caleb and Rachel, now legally separated but close friends, both attended, along with Rachel's new girlfriend, welcomed without a single comment. Marcus and I got engaged that spring, on the same porch where my father once ordered me to leave. My father walked me down the aisle that autumn, voice breaking as he told the small crowd he'd almost lost this day forever. Pastor Nolan officiated, the church now home to two other openly gay couples who joined since the policy changed. Grandma Eleanor, 92 and still sharp, sat in the front row, Walter's old photograph pinned proudly to her cardigan. Sometimes I still think about that rainy night, the shattered lemon cake, the words and hanging in the air. But I think more often now about the hammer in my father's hands, the porch steps we fixed together. Family, I learned, isn't the people who never hurt you. It's the people willing to finally do better. Millhaven is still a small town, still imperfect, still learning, but it is, at last, learning to include me. I drove 12 hours through the rain once, carrying a cake and a fragile hope neither survived the night. These days, the road home feels shorter, lighter, and every single time, someone is waiting to welcome me in. The Yindi.